All right, hello everybody. I think it's time for an update on my delving back into Soulsborne games after, kind of not getting them or being frustrated by them, for instance. So, I after that Confessions of a Soulsborne Skeptic video, I got to thank everybody for bringing in what would you call it? Lots of comments and descriptions of people talking about, you know, this game or that game or the other, and how Dark Souls 2 and Bloodborne are probably not the best places to start in that series, kind of thing. And even Demon Souls might necessarily not be the best place to start in that series. And so what I did, and what you will know that I did if you see my video from a couple of weeks ago, which was I think Frustration of a Soulsborne Skeptic. I picked up copies of Dark Souls 3, the Fire Fades edition, and I picked up a base copy of Elden Ring, both for PS4, because that's the console that I have. Well, I mean, that's not the only console that I have, but that's the console that I have that they're on, so there's where the overlap is. So I have played about 60 hours of Dark Souls 3 and about 50 hours of Elden Ring, and I am creeping through them. I mean, extremely slowly. But I'm also having a decent amount of fun. Um, I'm finding that, and I even actually spent a couple more hours on Bloodborne and Demon Souls. I plugged in my PS3 and I hooked up Demon Souls and played through the first level and a half of that. And so, yeah, I would say that I probably am starting to get it now. Dark Souls 2 was... I made two mistakes. Mistake number one was Dark Souls 2 is not a good entry thing because the incentive structure in it is so strange, right? I mentioned this a little bit before, but now I kind of understand it more in contrast. In Dark Souls 2, assuming that you're not in the infinite respawn covenant, right? The incentives of the game, the two major ones are this. Every time you die, the game gets a little bit harder, right? Because, you either lose a little bit of your health, and you run the risk of losing souls, and because the souls are limited, in the sense that the enemy respawn is limited, you run the risk of losing, potential levels, potential items that you could buy, which leads you into a very cautious kind of perspective, where, especially if you don't... So the thing about covenants in the Dark Souls games is that they don't really explain them very well. Like, the Covenant that gives you infinite respawn in Dark Souls 2, they're just like, this just makes the game extra hard in the in-game text. And so you're like, well, I don't want to do that. I'm losing. So, right, I'm going to hold off on that. And so you wouldn't think normally to click it, especially since, like, I don't know what the costs are to get out of a Covenant in Dark Souls 2. You can go to that cat in Majula, but, like, since I never bothered joining a Covenant, it also means that I was like, well, I don't know, I never got a chance to leave a covenant either. And so, Dark Souls 2 has these incentives in the basic game before you enter any covenants to discourage you from kind of experimenting, right? There's very limited Titanite shards, for instance, and so you're kind of limited in the number of things you're very limited in the number of things that you can upgrade. The number of enemies are limited, so you can't, like, farm Titanite shards for enemies that drop them, right? And so, Dark Souls 2 led me into a very slow, very restricted playstyle. Especially since it seemed like the other major incentive was that since the enemies only respawn a certain number of times, the what would you call it? The incentive as far as dealing with enemies is, well, I should start if I'm going to fight a boss, I should start at the bonfire nearest the boss, and basically wipe everything in a path between the boss fight and the bonfire, because you can do that, and then that way you can make sure that you make it to the boss fresh. Which also makes the game very repetitive, right? Because it's not just that these enemies respawn once or twice or 3 or 4 times, they respawn like 9 or 10 times. And so that means that you're fighting the same short path from Bonfire to Mist Door over and over and over again, which is, a little bit repetitive, and it requires you to be in a certain mindset to kind of tolerate that kind of gameplay. By comparison, in Elden Ring and in Dark Souls 3. Oh, and it's worth noting that in Demon Souls 2, not Demon Souls 2, but Demon Souls as well, Demon Souls also punishes you and makes the game harder when you die. In two ways, right? Because the more you die, you also end up... if you regain your humanity and die multiple times, you start to move that world towards pure black, which makes the enemies more difficult. And it's even worse than Dark Souls 2, where Dark Souls 2 you lose like a 16th of your health each death until you get down to like half. In Demon Souls, you just lose half your health to start, which is not so bad because they give you the Cling Ring early on, which cuts it to 1/4 of your health being cut away. You end up at a total of 3/4 instead of 1/2. And so dying costs you 1/4 of your life and 1 ring slot, which is not as bad as half your life. By comparison, Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring both have consistent respawns, which means that if you lose souls, all you've lost is some time, right? That might suck, right? You might say, oh man, I just spent 40 minutes grinding these things to get to the next, to get enough souls to the next level, and then I got killed accidentally and something got me and I fell off a thing. The only thing you've lost there is the 40 minutes, thankfully. If you repeat that, you'll lose another 40 minutes. But by comparison to like Dark Souls 2, if you do that a couple of times, you can lose 10,000, 20,000 souls, and you can miss out on the ability to do a couple of levels if you really, mess up quite a bit. And I've been messing up quite a bit. And it's not just the messing up, it's the fear of messing up, too. It makes you play differently. And so the fact that souls are just time in Dark Souls 3 and in Elden Ring means, I guess they're runes in Elden Ring, but I can't help calling them souls, means that worst case scenario, you say, okay, it sucks, I lost some time, I'll quit for tonight and I'll play again tomorrow and I'll get the souls back and I'll get that level and we'll be good to go. Or I'll get that item that I was trying to buy. The other thing that it does is it encourages you to have a little bit of a risk mindset because you can't clear out the enemies between bonfire and boss fight. In Dark Souls 3 especially, because in Elden Ring it seems like there's a tendency of the game to put a grace right next to the boss, which is not the case in Dark Souls 3. So in Elden Ring, I'll get to this in a second, but basically in both of these games, because souls or runes are just time, and because you could make up more time later on, you're encouraged to get into a mindset where you're willing to risk a certain number of souls. Like, I'm basically at the point where if I have a number of souls that's less than half of what I need to get to the next level, then I keep going, and I risk that number of souls. And, as I get closer and closer, as my Estus flask gets lighter and lighter, the amount of risk that I'm willing to take kind of drops off to a point where I'm like, okay, cool, I've gotten this far, I've gotten a little bit further than last time, I'm going to go back, I'm going to come through, I'm going to find a nice farming area, I'm going to get this level, because, I have 3/4 of what I need to gain a level, and so I'll just get that last quarter, and then I'll go gain the level, bank those souls, and then start again fresh in this area with a little bit stronger character. It's a slow strategy, but it seems to work reasonably well for me. The other thing that's worth noting is that Dark Souls 3 has homeward bones, and as far as I can see, Elden Ring does not have an equivalent item to get you out of like a boss fight. You can fast travel while you're in some dungeons in Elden Ring, but if you get into a boss fight, it seems to me like you're stuck there unless you either win or die. Which means that in Dark Souls 3, I'm willing to risk souls in a boss fight because if I'm careful, I can come back, I can get those souls, I can continue fighting, and then I'm not quite banking the souls, but I fight the boss, I have 3,000 souls, I fight the boss, I lose. I grab the souls, now I have 5,000, now I have 7,000, now I have 9,000. I keep losing to a boss, but every time, as long as I'm careful to go grab those souls, I don't lose them. And at some point, when the number gets large enough, I can say, all right, homeward bone, I'm out. Homeward bones are cheap and plentiful. That's another thing, is that having, limited souls means that you're less likely to try out new things at the store and just like spend souls on items or spend souls on ammunition like arrows and stuff. So another incentive difference between Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3. Yeah, and so in Dark Souls 3 I've been, fighting bosses with souls, risking souls, and occasionally, if I get enough souls stacked up and I'm like, okay, I don't think I'm going to win it this time, I'm going to homeward bone out of here, gain a level and try again. That's a reasonable strategy, and it allows me to, number one, not necessarily fight bosses fresh, right? If it's just like, okay, I'm only going to have 7 Estus shots for this one, that's fine. I just need to know that. I'm going to have to fight these things on the way there. Maybe one of them will hit me, who knows? I have a couple of different opportunities to heal myself, that kind of thing. So the style of Dark Souls 3 encourages risk-taking, encourages experimentation to a certain degree, and discourages super slow grinding. You certainly can grind in that game, and I certainly have a bit, but it's not like the game is encouraging you to do it, aside from giving you occasional areas where it's fairly easy to farm a couple thousand souls in 5 minutes if you need to. So that's kind of the incentive difference that I've gotten from these two games as far as like overall gameplay. The other thing that's worth noting is that Dark Souls 2 is full of ambushes. Every time you take 3 steps, someone drops in behind you and tries to backstab you. That is mostly not true in Elden Ring, in Dark Souls 3, and it's almost entirely not true in Elden Ring, because, well, Dark Souls 3 has better level design in the sense that, here's a situation I have to face. I'm going to get into it. I'm not going to find myself usually, surrounded by things behind me that just kill me. Sometimes it happens. Like I was just finishing the Irithil dungeon, and there's that chest in the sewer area where if you open it, a bunch of basilisks jump out at you. Yeah, they did get me, but like the interesting thing about that is that even though I lost the souls, I got the key that I wanted, and it's a fairly easy place to get back to and get those souls again. So nothing lost but 5 minutes. Elden Ring, by comparison, is I would say even better at this kind of like avoiding being ambushed because of the, albeit rudimentary, sneaking system that was introduced in Elden Ring. In Dark Souls 2 and in Dark Souls 3, I find it very hard to actually like sneak up on enemies and backstab them because there's no way to like ensure that I'm going slow enough that I'm not making sound or something like that. And even so, when you get up close, it seems like enemies start to turn around, even if you're like walking. So I don't know. In Elden Ring, the rudimentary stealth system is a little bit exploitable, but it does help you manage encounters a lot better. Whereas in, say, Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3, the way I'm managing encounters is by carrying a long bow and drawing out enemies one at a time with arrows. I like the ability to crouch down and know that I'm being stealthy, as opposed to like having to like be really careful about how far I push the stick while standing in Dark Souls. So let's see. One thing I'm noticing is that the bosses are also very different in these games. In Dark Souls 2, it seems to me that the boss the typical boss in Dark Souls 2 is a big guy with a long-range weapon who spins around really fast and hits wide areas very rapidly. And so it doesn't feel like you're doing anything other than fighting a really souped-up version of a standard enemy, like one of the knights. He has a spin slash, and he has this, and he has like a 270-degree arc on this cut for some reason, kind of thing. Elden Ring enemies are kind of like that in a way. They're very fast and they're very aggressive, and so I find myself in Elden Ring relying a lot on summons. I've got the jellyfish, and I'll just kind of guard and dodge until the jellyfish draws some aggro, and then I'll get in a couple of hits. The boss will aggro back on me. I'll dodge and avoid. There are some fights where you can't do that, like the Evergaol fights. You have to learn a little bit about how to fight stuff in those, but at the same time, it feels a lot like you're just like running up to a tornado of knives sometimes, and you're just like, I don't know. I can't get behind him. I can't get in front of him. There's no pauses. There's very few pauses in between his attacks. I don't know. I've been really enjoying the bosses in Dark Souls 3 because each of them seems to have a bit of a puzzle element to it. Um, for instance, the tree boss, the rotted tree boss that I showed on the previous video. It took me 2 minutes to figure out that you have to hit those like pustules on his back and on his front and on his arms to actually do damage. Fighting the crystal sage was really interesting because he has that initial behavior, and then once you get him down to about half health, he switches over to this different behavior, and you spend a lot of time. I spent a lot of time like, how am I supposed to dodge all of this? What am I doing here? What am I doing right? What am I doing wrong? And I felt a little bit, not accomplished necessarily, but I felt like, oh, that's the answer when I finally kind of got the hang of it and beat the boss. Like, there is a little bit of that. I think I'm still kind of net negative on boss fights as far as frustration versus like satisfaction. Like, I kind of just like really dislike not dislike, but like there's a lot more of like, oh god dang it kind of thing happening in the boss fights, and then when I finally win, it's like, okay, cool, I got it, now I get to move on. And so from that perspective, I think maybe the replay value of these games for me is not going to be very high, but even that seems to be changing as I play more and more, because I'm like thinking, oh, I wonder how this fight would be with this kind of character build. And I'm kind of doing like a short range sword dex build in both of the games, for the most part, because I hate min-maxing. And like, yeah, I think I'd like to try a stealth build, and I'd like to try a sorcery build, and I'd like to try a vigor build and see how that all works out. Because I'm actually, I mean, I might find some replay value in these, but who knows? We'll see. So I mentioned earlier that Dark Souls 2 and Demon Souls punish you and make the game harder every time you lose, which is not an encouraging system to have for a newbie player like I am, for the most part. Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring, I think, are doing things a little bit better. In Dark Souls 3 especially, because the embering system feels like a bonus. Rather than a I lost something, it's like, okay, I got this extra little boost, maybe it can help me through this other area, but like I don't feel like I lose a lot when I lose it. It does kind of suck when you lose it, especially when things are structured where you beat a boss, you get embered, and then you immediately get ganked by things in the next area. I just finished Pontiff Sylvain, and then I went in the next area, and there's those Aldrich faithful, and two of them just ganged up on me and destroyed me. I was like, I don't know what this is. Are these real people? Are these, fake NPC people like in Dark Souls 2? I don't know. And so I just lose my ember. It's like, well, I lose my ember, and are they going to come after me again now that I'm not embered? And it's like, no, as long as you're not embered, they're not going to bother you. It's like, okay, cool. The Elden Rune arc system is kind of blah because the arc runes themselves are so rare, and like you can just die randomly from things that like random mobs are just like, oh, look at what's this little thing here? Oh, it's surrounded by lobsters that shoot massive bursts of water that just two-shot me. Okay, I lost my thing. I have not yet used an arc rune in Elden Ring, so rare do they seem to be, and so temporary do their bonuses seem to be for me. It would be, as opposed to Dark Souls 3 where you get an ember every time you beat a boss, and the ember items are pretty plentiful and can be purchased in pretty decent and relatively cheaply too. Let's see. As far as dungeons, as I said earlier, bonfire placement in Dark Souls 3 necessitates some soul risk, which means that you're going to learn to say, all right, I may have 5,000 souls, but I'm going to throw them on the table and I'm going to try to get to the end of this dungeon and get to the boss and fight the boss and see what I can do. I've got homeward bones if I need them. If I stack up enough souls to gain a level, I'll jet out and bank them. But I'm going to risk these souls because there's no way to get to the boss without risking these souls. On the other hand, Elden Ring's twofold thing of, number one, you can escape anywhere at any time except from a boss fight, and number two, we seem to put graces before boss fights in general. Those two elements make me creep through Elden Ring dungeons very slowly, and also take multiple shots of, okay, I got through it and I only drank 2 tears. Okay, I got through it and I only drank 1 tear. Okay, I got through it and I still only drank 1 tear, but I now have full health from that 1 tear instead of having a third of a drink lost of health. So and so that seems to incentivize me inching through the dungeons in Elden Ring, which again kind of encourages me to be slower and risk less, which again is one of those things that makes the game less fun. As far as I've seen so far, I'm really enjoying the amount of risk that Dark Souls 3 kind of encourages me to take. And also, the stealth system in Elden Ring discourages risk as well. That's another thing. If you don't have a stealth system like Dark Souls 3, then it's on the table. And, can I kite enemies one at a time? Do I have to fight them more than one at a time? Or what? With Elden Ring, you can slow down and you can watch things move around and you can pick the right times to backstab things. But it does slow the game down, which means that you're having less fun, if that makes sense. On the other hand, as far as experimenting with weapons, I am really enjoying Elden Ring there. It took me a while to understand what the hell it was doing, but once I understood the Ash of War system, it was oh, and then it was okay, I kind of get this. And then, when I kind of understood it in Elden Ring, I started playing Dark Souls 3, and even though gems are rarer in Dark Souls 3, since I had an understanding of what they do and how they function, I didn't feel I need to experiment a lot with this. It was I get what this does now. I can use this. And so I was playing with a sharp scimitar, and now I'm playing with a sharp falchion and I think it's quality, the one that evens out the scalings but makes them both a little bit higher. So I think it's a quality mace, so that instead of a mostly strength scaling, it's even strength and dex scaling, which brings the dex scaling way up for a mace, which again is the character that I'm playing. It doesn't tell you this in Elden Ring, but the fact that you can move Ashes of War around back and forth and change them out without spending too much, I don't even think there's a cost at all, actually. I've been playing Dark Souls 3 exclusively for the last week and a half, because I was I've only put in 10 hours into Dark Souls 3, and I've put in 50 into Elden Ring. I should play some Dark Souls 3, and I started playing a bunch of Dark Souls 3. But, in Elden Ring, I was oh, I want to put this Ash of War on this thing and say, oh, do you want to remove it from this? I'm remove it. And it's oh, I can just take this Ash of War off of this weapon and put it onto this weapon. And when I put it on this weapon, I can even choose whether it's going to be, magic or sharp or heavy or what. And so I really like the kind of low-cost experimentation in Elden Ring to kind of play around with your weapon configurations. Now that I kind of understand the system better, I don't need to do as much experimentation, but but initially I was in Dark Souls 2, for instance, those gems are so rare that I was I don't know, let's make a magic mace. I don't know. Oh, they dropped a magic mace. Okay, so now I have 2 magic maces. Do I need to waste another thing to get it from a magic mace to a regular mace? I don't know. But that was a problem I had in Dark Souls 2, to the extent that I think I didn't use any of the, what are they called? I don't think they're gems in Dark Souls 2, but maybe they are. Anyway, I used one of them, and I used it wrong because I immediately got a weapon that was identical, and I was incredibly angry that I had to waste another thing to get this thing back into a regular thing, but there you go. So, more customization, more experimentation, making the cost of experimentation lower, I think is a good move. as far as it goes. And with Dark Souls 3, a lot of those gems, you can actually farm them. They're rare, but you can farm them. Let's see, other things I wanted to say. Oh, the multiplayer incentives. So, it looks to me, and I guess I don't know for sure, but it looks to me like Elden Ring is making multiplayer way more like by choice. Like you don't seem to get randomly invaded as much in Elden Ring. You can certainly make it easy for you to be invaded in Elden Ring, but so far I don't think any actual character has invaded me in Elden Ring. I've gotten invaded, not counting the Aldrich Faithful, which, like, gosh, I wish they would have told me about that before I walked into that area. But aside from that, I got invaded twice. One time the person vanished immediately, and the other time I had a pretty decent duel with somebody in the kitchen area right before the Pontiff, where Sigvard sits. I got into a fight with some guy who was using kind of a combination of, what was he doing? He was doing mostly sorceries, but he had some other things, and it was a good fight. I didn't get completely destroyed, and I didn't completely wipe the floor with the guy either. It was one of those things where it seemed a little bit laggy, and so I felt like maybe we were both a little bit off our game because of that. But like it was one of those things where I kind of pulled through and was glad to. And then I held my own for a little while against one of those Eldritch Faithful, and then a second one spawned. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna try to run back to the earlier part of the level so that when I die, I can get my souls more easily. I lost the Ember there too, which kind of sucked. But but like the incentive of if you want to make the game harder, you can, right? The Embered system in Dark Souls 3 is really good because, number one, if you're just breezing through the game, you're going to end up embered by beating bosses, and so therefore you're going to get people trying to slow you down, and they're going to be leveled approximately the same as you. They're going to have similar weapon upgrade levels, which I think is fine. Now that I've looked into it more and I understand it, it's like, oh, and once I lost my Ember to those Aldrich Faithful, it's just like, oh, okay, so, like, I was like, oh, man, do I have to just quit here? Like, do I give up? And it's like, no, if you're not embered, you can go in, you can fight all the regular mobs, and you can get to the next bonfire, and no one can invade you if you're not embered. I'm like, that's a great idea. As opposed to, like the extremely opposite position that I was in Dark Souls 2, where I don't think I was being invaded by real people, but the way that the game seemed to be set up is that it would, like, spawn these really, really, like, griefer NPCs. Like you're in the second level of the area and you fight this guy and he shoots this magic spell at you that takes like 3/4 of your life. I forget what his name was, but he was a pain in the rear end to kill, and he just gets to do that infinitely. You're in that area, that really obnoxious area in Dark Souls 2 where everything is knee-high water, and that guy spawns and he just starts spamming long-range sorceries at you, and you're like, I hate it so much. But in Dark Souls 3, the NPC invaders seem a little bit less like griefer. Like they're not quite as insanely overpowered for what you're currently at, and the characters that the real people that come in seem to be reasonably well matched. In Elden Ring, the multiplayer is you can do covenants, you can do the arena, you can put down call signs, but unless you want to engage in multiplayer, you're not really going to engage in multiplayer. And there are the occasional like invader character, invader NPC in Elden Ring, and they're hard, but most of them are optional. Except for that one guy. I was at the village of the Albinarics, and I went back to the round table to level up, and I'm like, why is it dark? Why can't I? And then I died 7 times to that what's his name, Ensha. I like the way that I like it when missed doors are available in front of the boss before you fight them. That's something that Dark Souls 3 kind of bugs me about. Like, if I'll be running through an area and if it weren't for a player comment that's like tough monster ahead, it'd be like, then I should stop and I should go retreat and I should spend my souls to level up and I should come back again, maybe, kind of thing. Because I get why you would want to do it, like the tree fight. You kind of want someone to walk into that big area and be like, ooh, it looks like a boss arena, but like I just see these regular little guys, and there's this big tree in the corner, and you might not notice that it's like moving and breathing slowly, and so like I don't know. I like being informed of when there's a boss fight so that I can like be prepared for it. But again, in the games where souls are just time, I can see how you could get away with it to a certain degree. It's nice to see the missed doors when they're there for especially big boss fights. But like, it's not that big a loss if I lose a couple of souls from blundering into a thing. And after that, they put a missed door up so you know where to stop. Let's see. I've mentioned the rudimentary stealth system in Elden Ring. I like it. I like being able to make it harder for me to be ambushed. The biggest problem I seem to have with combat in these games is when I get attacked by multiple different characters, because the targeting is kind of meh. Except in Elden Ring. In Elden Ring, they seem to have finally gotten the lock-on to work properly. In Demon Souls, in Dark Souls 2, and in Dark Souls 3, I've been having a lot of trouble with that R3 button, lock-on thing. It just locks on to God knows what, and you just are like, and then like your character like beelines at the wrong enemy. There's that spot right before the Crystal Sage where there's that magician right before the door, and when you go up to the magician, you basically aggro a dude with a spear and a shield. And for some reason, I would try to lock onto that magician, and it would always lock onto something way far behind him, that guy with the spear. And so I would like try to hit the magician, but like my guy would aim at the spear guy who's a mile away, and the magician would just completely destroy me with spells as I was trying to do that. Later in the game, Dark Souls 3 seems to kind of try to teach you to fight without locking on sometimes, especially against groups. But I think that the lock-on in Elden Ring actually feels really good. Like, it almost never targets not who I'm trying to target, and it seems easier to move back and forth. And the lock-on like stays on more. Like, I had a lot of problems with Dark Souls 3 with like my lock like vanishing, and I have to click it back on, or I want to click it off and it seems like it just holds on, kind of thing. Like, the targeting in Dark Souls 3 is still a little meh. That's one of the major downsides, I think, to that game. Especially with the camera being as goofy as it is sometimes. I don't know. What I will say that I have learned is that I have really started to enjoy the exploration in Dark Souls 3 and in Elden Ring. In Dark Souls 3, the exploration is a little bit more restricted, but the dungeons do have a bunch of loops and different floors and different areas and different enemies, and you kind of have to look around and figure out, okay, so there's this locked door here, I have to find a way around behind it so that I can get to the other side of it, so it's a one-way door kind of thing. I've been enjoying exploring a lot in Dark Souls 3, and I've been really enjoying exploring in Elden Ring, to the point where I just spend a bunch of time on Torrent running around looking for things, or just looking for those little glowing skulls that have 200 runes inside each of them. That was something that I discovered that I was like, whoa, this is a thing. Because at first I wasn't breaking the skulls because I was like, oh, I don't need to do anything with those. And then I broke one of the glowing ones and it dropped 200 runes. And I'm like, oh, that's a thing? I've been seeing those all over the place. And then I started breaking more of them because I'm like, well, I mean, it's not just that it's 200 runes, it's 200 runes in the form of a usable item. So I could just gather those and put them in my inventory. And then I discovered that the glowing skulls actually respawn or spawn randomly in areas. And so it's like, oh, so this isn't just like a little bit of a bonus where eventually it kind of peters out in how useful it is. It's actually something that you just get from exploring. You get 200 souls, every so often from exploring because those skulls pop up and repopulate over time. So that's been, I've just spent a lot of time exploring in Elden Ring. And just the other day I was looking something up because I've been trying to mostly play these games blind, but when something really gets to me, I'll go look it up. And I was looking up something in Elden Ring, and I discovered that even though I spent a bunch of time exploring Limgrave and the Stormhill areas, like, there's still stuff I missed in them. So back to exploring when I get back to that game, I guess. Yeah, I've just been spending a ton of time just wandering around in Elden Ring, which means I'll probably take like 300, 400 hours to beat that game. Finding alternate passages in Dark Souls 3 is also kind of fun. I'm getting to the point where I'm like, oh, I kind of get it, you know? Whereas before it was like, oh, this is a hole that if I fall down, I die. I'm starting to see those more, you know, early on, and like starting to see like, oh, this might be a shortcut. Oh, how do I get over here? Okay, I lead over here. There's a hop down here. Throw one of those little stones that tells you whether you can make the jump or not, kind of thing. And so I've been playing around with that, and I've been enjoying that. there are like fake walls in Dark Souls 3, which you just, if you hit the wall with your weapon, they just open up. And often they have like a thing pointed at them. I've been enjoying that a lot more than the extremely difficult to find secret doors in Dark Souls 2, especially when there's a ton of these secret doors in Dark Souls 2 in certain areas, and you just like have to like jam the X button over and over again as you like hump the walls. I never like the tap the button repeatedly while humping the walls mechanic. It's one of the reasons why I don't like Final Fantasy IX, because there's always those stupid exclamation points popping up. It's like, oh, I gotta walk along this wall and make sure I catch all the exclamation points, or else I'm missing something. Yeah, so the other thing is, as far as like satisfaction of beating tough bosses, which was a big thing that people talked about in the comments to the earlier video, I'm still finding, I think, that my frustration is greater than my satisfaction in Dark Souls 3. And then the fact that you get all this help in Elden Ring kind of limits my frustration, but like I'm now understanding why someone would want to try like a no summon run in Elden Ring as well. I don't know. It's one of those things where I don't know whether I would actually find enjoyment in it in general. Like the enemies and the bosses in Elden Ring especially seem to be like way too aggressive tornadoes of knives, where it's like I want the aggro off of me for a second so I can take a drink and try to come up with a battle plan. However, in Elden Ring there are those Evergaol things. Gaol, Gaol is like an old-fashioned word for jail. It's the word that turned into jail, basically, in modern parlance. And I always feel funny pronouncing it as Gaol, because like it might actually be like jail. It might sound more like jail than that. I don't know. But like the thing about those Evergaol things is that you don't get any summons for those usually. And so like I've just had to fight those bosses and win them, you know, by myself, which does kind of teach you how to get past these tornadoes of knives sometimes. As far as satisfaction, the best satisfaction I think I get from beating bosses is not from like, oh, it's really hard and I had to like really, really figure out all of his patterns and memorize them. The satisfaction I get the most is from like, oh, this boss is not just a boss, it's a puzzle, right? And so like the Crystal Sage, I think, is a really good example of that, where it's like, okay, we've gotten to stage 2, what exactly is he doing? Okay, he's calling these guys, but all of these guys are shooting these blue magic projectiles at you. Oh, but only the blue guys who are fakes shoot the blue, and only one guy who is the real one shoots purple. It took me a couple of tries to figure that out, kind of thing. And like, whereas in Elden Ring you kind of have help to fight the bosses, and so like it's not so bad. And in Dark Souls 3 you get the satisfaction of like solving a puzzle to beat the boss. In Dark Souls 2 they're kind of the worst of both worlds, where they're just these aggressive, long-range, gigantic things that spin around and are sharp and painful. And yeah, they're not as fun as Dark Souls 3 or Elden Ring. I kind of mentioned targeting already. I've been having a lot of trouble with the lock-on in Dark Souls 3. In any combat involving more than one enemy, it seems to always choose the one that I don't want to target. I've gotten to the point now where I'm starting to understand to just like, because Dark Souls 2 and Elden Ring, by the way, actually have this thing where they like lock you to a cardinal direction on the pad a little bit. So that like you can kind of, if you push a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right, you'll still keep going straight. Dark Souls 2 is especially bad in this sense. Dark Souls 3 doesn't do that. If you push up and to the left at 15 degrees, your character will move up and to the left forward and to the left at 15 degrees, which means that you are less, you need less lock-on to fight enemies, because if you just push the stick in the right direction, your character will aim in the right direction, as opposed to Dark Souls 2, where you can push the stick in the right direction, but because the enemy is only 25 degrees off, you haven't reached that 30-degree point where you start to move in a slightly different direction, and so you just aim straight to the left, and you miss. Like, getting rid of that cardinal lock is what you need in order to fight effectively without the lock-on. And like, therefore, if you're going to fight without the lock-on, if you're going to fight, you either need to have the lock-on work really well, as it does in Elden Ring, or you need to have the ability to fight without the lock-on, as you can in Dark Souls 3. Dark Souls 2 is the worst of both worlds, where the lock-on doesn't quite work the way you want it to, and you get locked into these weird cardinal directions, so you can't fight effectively in a diagonal. The other thing that bugs me about Dark Souls 3 and Dark Souls 2 lock-on is that it like ignores idle enemies. It's like, I know there's an enemy there, I can see it. It's, let me lock onto it, please. It's the only thing here. I just want to make sure that I'm targeting it and that my shield's in the right place. And like, yeah, until the thing aggroes on you, it just doesn't allow you to target it. Like, it's not just that if it's idle, it's that it has to be like idle, but in like a non-combat animation. There's in Dark Souls 3, right after the halfway fortress in the Road to Sacrifice, in the Crucifixion Woods, there's a single one of those guys that has the long tree branch, right? And he's kind of like standing a little bit in the swamp with like his hands over his face. He will aggro if you walk within 2 or 3 steps of him. You know, he won't aggro if you walk within 5 or 10 steps of him. He mostly stays idle. But you can't right-click target him until he aggros. And since he's standing right next to a tree, it's a little hard to line that up without accidentally hitting the tree with your weapon and recoiling. I've had that happen a couple of times. As far as things that I still kind of wish I had in these games, I wish there was more character interaction. Like, for instance, in Elden Ring, there's that guy that you can ask about the different Elden Lords, where you talk to him, and then you get a menu, and you can be like, about this guy, about this guy, about this guy, about this guy. I grew up on, like, Ultima, the Ultima series, for instance. And I kind of feel like it'd be great if we had a little bit more interaction with most characters. Most characters in Dark Souls 3, they will, depending on how far along you are in their subquest, which often means just giving them scrolls, they will like say one thing over and over again for talk, and that's all you get. It would be really cool if there was more dialogue options, where it's like, oh, I want to ask you, okay, so I found you in the Irithyll dungeon. What can you tell me about the Irithyll dungeon? And she'll say, oh, what's her name, Carla? You know, she'll say, oh, you know, I was in prison, so I don't know much. What I do know is blah, 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 blah. You know, I heard the jailers talking about such and such and such. Or like, you know, when they brought me there, I was blindfolded, you know, but I did remember turning left here and right here. And you know, I heard something, you know, it'd be really cool to have more dialogue options. I wish there was more character interaction, because the game can be very cryptic at times, and sometimes you just want like a character to say like, no, nobody knows, you know, nobody knows what goes on in this castle. You're gonna have to figure it out yourself, as opposed to like, is there somebody who will tell me about this kind of thing? There's the giant fire demon guy. Oh, right. Sigwald in the Undead Settlement. There's that giant fire demon, and Sigwald is just sitting there. He's like, I wonder what we should do. And, you know, eventually you just run down. He's like, oh, no, not yet. And it's hard to tell whether there was ever a point where you could get him to the point where he's like, oh, yeah, I think we're ready. Let's take this thing on. It would have been nice to have some kind of information there, as opposed to him just going, over and over again. The open world in Elden Ring was a little daunting at first. Like, the ability to just jump was like mind blowing to me coming in from Dark Souls 2. It's like, what do you mean? What do you mean jump? What do you mean I can climb this thing? That was very weird at first. But the other thing about Elden Ring is that the open world is so large, and like it's so large that it's very easy to actually miss characters. There's the what is she, like a nun, the traveling blind nun who you hand those grapes to. Like, I found her one time, and then I like played through a good chunk of the game, and then I accidentally found her another time way earlier in the game, in the second place that you meet her. I was like, oh, I'm way past here already, but like here she is. I can't believe I missed her, but it took that much time for me to find her. I don't know how you would fix that, but it is something that I noticed that was like, oof, it is really easy to miss characters in this game. Little comment here. I feel really bad for the blind nun in Dark Souls 3. What's her name? Irina? Like, you're like, yeah, come to Firelink Shrine, or we'll keep you safe there. And she picks the darkest, dankest, wettest part of the dungeon to sit. And like, she doesn't like have a chair or like a thing that she sits on. She just sits there on the ground. You're like, you could come up to where the candles are and where it's nice and warm and not wet. I just feel bad for the character. The other thing that kind of made me laugh was the blacksmith at the round table in Elden Ring. He thinks you're dead if you're gone for like 10 minutes. You're like, you do something and you go away for 10 minutes and you come back. He's like, oh, I thought you were dead. And it's like, I was gone for 10 minutes, dude. It's really okay. There was the blacksmith in Dark Souls 2 where he would say, oh, I thought you were dead, but only if you were gone for a few hours, kind of thing. Other things of note, I would really like in Elden Ring more like concrete enemy names, because what I've been doing with these two games actually is I've been keeping notes of like, there's a path here, I went through this area and I fought this thing, there was a locked door here, I need to make sure I come back and check it out later on. In Elden Ring, there's all these different kinds of enemies, and unless you get these rare drops from them that have like suggestions of their names in either the name of the item or the description of the item, it's like, I don't know what to call these things. Tribal dudes. I don't know. I was in the underground river area, the first one in Elden Ring, and like there's these things, and I'm like, what are they called? Like, I don't know. The other thing is that Elden Ring has a compass. Oh man, I wish I had a compass in Dark Souls 3. I mean, like, just to be like, okay, the start of this dungeon, you're facing west. You came from the east. There's a locked door to the north. Go to it. Now I actually have like the ability to say, like, for when I write down what I'm doing, it's like, oh, I went left and I picked the second door on the left. It's like, I went west, I went east. It'd be much nicer than having to kind of like landmark everything. But that's pretty much all I've got. I'm enjoying these games more now. I'm getting to the point where I think I want to try out Dark Souls 1 and Sekiro, but I do think I'm going to finish Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring, at least one playthrough before I buy more games. Unless they're like really on sale or something like that. And I'm probably going to try to play through Demon Souls again. Demon Souls is a very different game now that the servers are dead. This is for Demon Souls, the original on PS3. The servers are just dead. They're gone. Back in the day, they had this neat idea of like world tendency. And like, they would give you like pure white tendency on some holidays, and they give you pure black tendency on some holidays. And the thing about the tendency is that if they were pure white or pure black, it would unlock things in the dungeons. That's all gone now. You can't do it. There's no way to do it. And so the way that you have to play Demon Souls now is you basically have to never play with humanity, which sucks. And you have to beat all the bosses, and you get to pure white tendency, and then you do a bunch of things to get yourself to pure black tendency, and then you can unlock everything in Demon Souls, which, like, that is just a not very fun method of play, at least for me. But I still think I would like to play through the game, maybe not unlock everything, but maybe just play through it. Because one of the things that I kind of like about Demon Souls for PS3 is the lack of, what would you call it, like visual clutter? Like, just because the PS3 was a much simpler device, right? There's a lot less happening on screen in Demon Souls for the most part. There's, fewer, swaying grass and trees with leaves and stuff like that. Things are a lot simpler looking, which is kind of nice from a mechanical perspective, in the sense that I can just be like, yes, I just get to focus now on the things that are part of the game, as opposed to like, really worrying too much about how cool the tree looks as it sways in the breeze. So anyway, this has been a long video, but I don't know. I've really changed my perspective on these games because I, like, number one, I looked this up. Like, I was having so much trouble parrying in Dark Souls 3. And in Dark Souls 2 as well, but like in Dark Souls 3 I was having a lot of trouble parrying. And finally I went over to the wiki and I looked it up, and it's like, oh, different shields and things have different parry windows, which is kind of like one of those things that I guessed at, but like I didn't realize how bad it was. And it's like, if you want to parry, you should probably be using a parrying shield. Otherwise you're going to have like 30% as much of a parrying window, and you're just going to miss most of the time. So I have spent some time on like the wikis and stuff a little bit here and there, just trying to learn a little bit more about the game mechanics, because that's the other thing that that's the other kind of minor downside about these games, is that like the mechanics are a little bit vague sometimes, where it's like, oh, I would have loved if they said like, if they like right out said, by the way, it is much easier to parry with these small shields as opposed to this large shield, and it's even easier to parry with these specific parrying shields, the buckler or the target shield. So, this is a long enough video. That's all I've got for today. I'll probably have another one of these videos out once I beat one or both of these games, just to kind of talk about next steps. Maybe I'll say something about Sekiro or something at some point, because that one seems to be more parry-centered, but it's also a little bit more forgiving for the parry. So maybe that'll work out. I got pretty good at parrying in like Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. So we'll see how I can do if I ever get to the point where I play Sekiro. Anyway, that is Conversion of a SoulsBorne Skeptic. And I just want to say thanks once more to everybody who was kind enough to put, detailed, and even the simpler comments too. All of them were helpful to kind of get me to break out of my shell, play Dark Souls 3, play Elden Ring, and and not just limit myself to Bloodborne, which is kind of especially hard. And unforgiving. Like, I really like playing sword and board, and like you can't do that in Bloodborne. And Dark Souls 2, which is like has the incentives all wrong to be fun and engaging, and instead kind of designs itself in the process of being a slog. But yeah, I've been enjoying Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring, and I'm thinking about playing Dark Souls 1 and Sekiro eventually, but probably not for a little while. Anyway, that's all I got for today. As always, thanks for watching, thanks for listening. Thanks for comments and stuff, because like otherwise, if I had not gotten any comments about Dark Souls and stuff and telling me to try these other games out, I probably wouldn't have bothered. I probably would have gotten through some more of Dark Souls 2 and then given up. So yeah, I appreciate that. And that's all I've got for today. So thanks for watching, thanks for listening. If you like what I'm doing and you want to support the channel, you know what to do. Otherwise, I will see you next time. Have a good one.